Today's News Talk, TNT Radio.
Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome back to the program. I'm your host, Patrick Henningsen. We are live and direct for the next 2 hours here on TNT, Today's News Talk. Thank you for rejoining us. As I mentioned before the break, big news in Europe. Shocked a lot of people. Some are not surprised at all, though. What we're interested here is really finding out what it means, why it happened, how it happened, and what we might expect for any substantive policy changes going forward in these European countries and at a Brussels level, maybe at a NATO level, perhaps. Can we read the tea leaves from these election results in Europe? What can we derive from what's happened here over the weekend? Let's bring on to the stage Mats Nilsson. He is a political commentator, a historian. He's also joining us from Sweden, which is becoming a big player in Europe after its entry into NATO. I don't think that's such a great thing. Mats, of course, we've spoken about that. First of all, Mats, your reaction on what's happened over the weekend, initial thoughts.
Well, I'm afraid, Patrick, that I'm going to kind of perhaps disappoint you, because my assessment of the election is that nothing much really happened. It was really a kind of a small impact situation to the parliamentarian situation in the European Parliament, and for just one obvious reason. That liberal center bloc, which is what von der Leyen depends upon, it's the center-right European People Party. That's the liberal conservatives, and the left with the social democrats and the liberals, as we say here in Europe. They kept their majority. I mean, yes, granted, it's much slimmer now, it's much smaller, and the far-right parties do have much more of a potential ability to say something, but since they're so disunited amongst themselves, I don't really think anything much is going to happen. And sadly, I'm quite convinced, or from my point of view, sadly, von der Leyen is going to get re-elected because she will have the majority. And even though individual EPP members might perhaps vote against her, because you have to remember, voting for von der Leyen is a closed vote. Everyone writes the name on a piece of paper and goes forward and drops the ballot. So people can, of course, go against her. Last time she was elected, it was with a very slim majority, and even the Germans voted against her, or I think abstained to vote for her. But then, war creates an opportunity, and von der Leyen has established herself as a steadfast and loyal member of the War Party and the War Commission, and everything that has to do with going against Russia. So she's actually, I think, become stronger, which is frightening, but still a fact. So as for policy within the European Union, first off, the European Parliament doesn't really matter all that much. Secondly, nothing much really happened. So the way I see it, the policy will still be created amongst the European Council of Ministers and within the European Commission. So there you have it. I'm afraid I'm not especially interesting or especially bold in my assessments. I'm quite legally boring, but that's my humble opinion. Nothing much is going to happen after this election. It's just more hoo-ha than anything substantial.
Do you think we can take, for instance, with the AfD increasing their share in the German assembly there, and also in France as well with the National Rally? Can we look at that in a sense, Mats, of a type of a mini referendum or pre-referendum, if you will, on European policy vis-a-vis Ukraine and Russia?
I think yes, we can, of course, because you have to remember the fundamental issue here. If you're an American wondering what's all this parliamentarian stuff about, the European Union is not a democracy. So basically, when the citizens of each individual European country votes, they vote for or against the current national government. So I think there's been quite a clear signal to the governments, whatever current government is in power in the individual nations within the European Union, that the citizens are not especially satisfied with the current legislative policies in regards to Ukraine. So there will be lessons learned for a lot of individual countries and their governments given this election. But on a European level, I don't think, sadly, much will come of it. And one thing that I would like to mention before I forget about it is that the European Union has actually proposed a role in the upcoming commission for a defense commissioner. Now, this is just one of the things that points to the parliament doesn't really have anything to do with it, but the commission has even more to do with it. So besides from having a foreign relations commissioner, they will now have a defense commissioner. And what really scared me was that the Estonian Chihuahua, Kaja Kallas, has said that she is actually interested in having the position of a defense commissioner. Now, having a Estonian politician with slight delusions of grandeur wanting to invade and occupy St. Petersburg might not be the most wise decision when it comes to having a commissioner for defense within the European Union. But then again, the European politicians aren't that wise anymore. So we'll see. But the European Parliament election, no changes will come from what happened on Sunday.
Right. So you got von der Leyen possibly, rolling over into another term as the greatest unelected super bureaucrat in the world, effectively appointed, let's just say, as you kind of explained there. And then Kallas is defense minister. But Matt, you remember over the years they used to say, if only women were in positions of leadership, we wouldn't have any of these wars. Things would just be a lot more peaceful and amicable. It's because of all that testosterone and alpha male energy is the reason why there's so many wars in the world. So what could possibly go wrong?
Well, I think I would actually be happy if there was a steadfast alpha male veteran who has actually seen war that was put in a place of influence. Because if you look at the politicians who lived through different wars, they have been less keen on starting them. I think if you haven't been in a war, you feel you have more to prove. And I think a lot of these women and men, for that matter, that haven't been in the army or haven't sat in a foxhole and had shells flying overhead and had bullets fired in your general direction, they want to prove that they are staunch supporters of a militaristic historical tradition for that country. However, if you have a politician in charge that has actually said, I'm battle hardened, you don't have to doubt that I can fight, but right now I don't think we need to. So I think it's a bit of a psychology as well. And you have a lot of military men in Europe that have been feeling left out for a few decades. They haven't really seen any action. So it's a dangerous situation because there's always new cadres of military men and politicians wanting to prove themselves in a way that's going to be detrimental to peace and going to be detrimental to the prosperity for the vast majority of the European citizenry. So I'm not one of those people who say as long as we have a woman there is going to be peace. Far from it. I think as long as we have a politician who truly realizes what a war means for everyone, then we would have peace. So it's it's not a guarantee, but I think that the chances are better if you have a battle-hardened veteran in charge of different countries.
Yeah, and we have it's not as maybe acute of a problem in the United States, although it is a big problem. We have our whole entire Joint Chiefs of Staff, all the Pentagon top brass. None of them don't have any conventional combined warfare experience on the ground. All the people that do are on television or on the internet as pundits. The actual people in charge, they haven't commanded any tank brigades to victory or anything like that. They've literally risen up through the ranks of the military super bureaucracy, really by being yes men and being good politicians. And so this is the problem we have in America. And people like Douglas McGregor and Daniel Davis and Ray McGovern and some of these more sort of, canny, honest political commentators, veterans of military, of the CIA, etc., they've commented about this, saying this is actually a real problem because invariably they're going to be signing their compatriots, the government, the country, up to a mission which they have no idea what's involved. It's all done theoretically, tabletop exercises, big budgets for drills, run-throughs, but when it really comes down to actually fighting, who has the experience? Nobody in the United States. Certainly, Iraq doesn't really count. They carpet bombed Iraq and Libya and rolled in with the tanks in the case of Iraq after flattening the country. But that's not really going to be feasible going forward. So Russia has a lot of experience in combined warfare now in the last 2 years. They're winning handedly by all accounts in Ukraine. They're advancing and retooling their entire economy. Their political economy has also been oriented towards the reality that they might be going to war with NATO. So they made those decisions, Mats, in Russia. But has Europe done the required things in order to match that effort by the Russian Federation in this case? What's your opinion on that?
No, but we most certainly haven't, and for the simple reason that when we speak of Europe, you have to remember it's not a defined demos. It's not a unity. It's different warring tribes, basically. You have Hungary, that's called Europe as much as Sweden is, where Sweden is raring to go and wanting to do everything for Ukraine, while Hungary says, hang on, let's perhaps have a bit of diplomacy before we start anything. And both these countries are supposed to be intertwined and trying to find some geopolitical common ground. That's the so-called European policy. With this said, what I'm meaning to say is that every single nation in the European Union is trying to do its best out of what it perceives as a danger to their nation. So Sweden is ramping up production for the military-industrial complex, and I mean the Wallenberg industrial sphere is of course happy, while other countries in Europe are making other priorities. So should war come, I think the civil society will buckle quite quickly within the European Union, because there is no real appetite for war as such. There was just a recent poll that said that I think 65 to 68% of the citizens in Europe were opting for a diplomatic solution in Ukraine now. And that means that there's a discrepancy between Brussels and the new war commissioner and the citizens who are kind of growing tired of this geopolitical shenanigans going on between Moscow and Washington and Kiev and London and Brussels. So for these reasons, I think the European Union isn't going to solve the pressing economic necessity of starting a military economic budgetary system, which is much needed in Europe, but there is no politician can push this through unless, and this is where the this is where the conspiracy predictionist in me awakens. Unless there is a Pearl Harbor-esque kind of event that proves that makes the European people believe that the Russians are coming, the Russians are aggressive, perhaps the Russians bomb the Baltic states, or perhaps the Russians shut down a Finnish plane somewhere in over the Baltic Sea. You name it, anything could happen. And once that happens, the media quickly steps in, turns on the heat. There is no critical discussions, perhaps apart, from the usual suspects, yourself, Kit Clarenberg, a few others that say, hey, hang on, this doesn't really make any sense. But, that's not going to matter, because all the mainstream media in Europe are going to say, the Russians are coming, now we have to switch to a war footing. And of course, quickly, the voters and the citizens that are uncritical will get behind their government, and you can create a war. We all know the history. It's World War I all over again. So I'm not saying it's going to happen, but I'm 50 years of age now, and I've seen enough to be able to say that conspiracies aren't. They do happen. They're not theories. They're actually predictions.
Well, more than that, you mentioned World War I, of course, Mats, famously, and I'm sure you know this history very well, the feeling of inevitability that was in the air prior to the outbreak of World War I. This is what we read in our history books. And why was that? There were all these entangling alliances that created this kind of, group inertia towards this inevitable clash. And yesterday, in fact, Serbia's president, Alexander Vučić, gave such a warning. And I'll read this quote. It's quite extraordinary, Matt. So I want to get your reaction to this. This is Vučić, who I would regard as somewhat neutral in the sense that he's having to straddle Europe and Russian fealty and loyalty at the same time. Not an easy position to be, with the United States breathing down your neck as well within the country, So this is what he says: we are heading for a major catastrophe, and it seems that the train has already left the station, and you can no longer be stopped. No one in the West is talking about peace anymore, only more war. The West thinks it can win and take out Russia. I think the West is wrong. Both sides now believe it is an existential issue for them. So I don't think they will find a solution other than war, and everything is at stake. In Europe, the leaders act as big heroes, but they are not honest and do not tell their citizens that they will pay all of the price, a big price, if it comes to war. That's the president of Serbia, genuinely concerned, Matt. So this is not like political rhetoric here. I sense a lot of sincerity in his comments here, because, of course, he knows that his country will probably end up on the front line. Your thoughts?
Well, when we're talking about the 1914 start of the Great War, I think this is where we're back. The history never repeats itself, but you can definitely hear the echoes. And being from this region, Vučić knows quite well how quickly things can turn south, because once you're tied up in these alliances, you can't back down as an individual country. Politically, it becomes too dangerous for you to back down, and then you must go forward. And behind these interests, back in 1914 and now in 2024, you have to remember there are businesses involved in this as well. There are businesses looking for government contracts. There are businesses involved through vast financial networks who have hedged their bets on trying to keep small conflicts and small wars going, perhaps even within the area, the Balkan region once again. But the danger is that the tinder is so dry that a small spark could set everything ablaze again. And that's the black swan event that I think Vučić is well aware is coming. And the pressing issue I would say, is that there is no politician strong enough to stand up and say, let's take a few steps back, because they're so pressured to keep pushing forward, like we talked about before. They have to prove themselves as staunch providers for a historic grand tradition for their individual countries. And I'm worried because there are so many small fires now within Europe. Moldova is another one of these places where things could go south pretty quickly. And once it happens, things will get out of hand. No one can close Pandora's box. So it's ominous and it's dangerous, and it's a situation where I think the historians once again will look back at 2024, and like we today say about 1914, how could they be so mad? Historians in 80 years will say, how could they be so mad? Well, we know. We study our history. We know why they're so mad. Unfortunately, you and I and a few others, we're not in any majority to make a difference. But we try. At least we try.
I never thought I would be asking myself the question in my lifetime, Mats, having studied history and from the junior high school level, 12, 13, 14, right up through undergraduate. I never thought I'd be asking myself the question, has Europe learned its lessons from recent history? I really thought it was inconceivable that it hadn't. With the formation of the European Union, etc., the fall of the Iron Curtain. When I was coming out of education, it all seemed like everything was, it's like that British pop song, things can only get better. Well, they're about to get worse. Is there a solution coming out the other end of this? Is there a political solution? That's something that we're exploring, because these are things that we actually might be able to contribute to in journalism, in the media, in the commentary sector. So I want to talk about potential political solutions on the other side with Mats Nilsson joining us on the live link right now from Sweden. The trends in Europe, where are they taking us? We'll explore this more on the other side. This is TNT, Today's News Talk. We'll be right back.
Patrick Henningsen talks on today's News Talk Radio, TNT.
Welcome back to the program, everybody. Welcome back. I'm Patrick Henningsen, your host. I'm here with Mats Nilsson, a political commentator and historian based in Sweden. We're talking about the European elections. How consequential are they? Certainly, a change in leadership might make a cosmetic difference, especially in a country like France. But the big question is there going to be any change to the underlying policy? That's the big question that we're going to address here. Now, Ed Snowden, famously of the Snowden leaks, a famous whistleblower decamped currently as a refugee in a political asylum case in Russia. He's now a Russian citizen. He had this to say. He's arguing that the defeat of the pro-war politicians in the elections is not a good sign for Joe Biden. Granted, he might have a point there. He's suggesting here that Washington, D.C. Is going to have to decide whether this conflict is going to go forward or not. And then ultimately, he believes that whether it starts or finishes is really in the hands of the United States, and the European countries will kind of go along with the ride. This is what Ed Snowden's opined on Twitter here. And certainly on paper, Matt, it does look like you could read that, Marine Le Pen and the AfD, which is regarded as far right. And this is another question I want to ask you. How far right, in your opinion, I mean, this term is so elastic these days. How far right is the AfD and the National Rally led by Marine Le Pen in France? Or have we got the calculation of these old 20th century political reference terms completely off? Go ahead, Mats.
Well, we don't. I'm not going to say Le Pen might well turn out to be another Italian Meloni. Which is a far right light, and you have to remember that the right I rather call them right populist parties than far right parties, actually. They're deeply divided. They're very divided on very strategic central issues, such as enlargement, relationship to China, trade, the EU, European Union, US relationship. They're divided on that, and not forgetting they're definitely divided on Ukraine, which means that even if Le Pen should be able to do something in France, it's not for certain that that's going to affect the policy of the European Union. Because once in a situation of political influence, she might well be bought off, such as has happened in Italy.
Mm.
So I'm definitely not going to say she's far right. I would say she's right populist, and she's definitely one that the European centrist could consider working with. Right now, of course, she's persona non grata, but should she be elected, the tune will change and they will adapt, and they will say, oh, well, look at what happened in Italy. Perhaps we can talk to Le Pen in France as well. And they will kind of bring her into the fold, and she will be neutralized as a so-called threat to the establishment. As for Macron,
go ahead.
Sorry.
Go ahead. Emmanuel Macron. He's been his art of political survival has been impressive, Mats. So should we count him out so early?
No. Definitely not. Because I think I'm not going to say I can put myself into the mind of Macron, because I doubt anyone can. First of all, he's French, and no one really understands the French anyway. But he's also a French politician, but he's a very savvy politician. I have to grant him this. And I think what he did with this surprise snap election was he's counting on his party that was created from nothing in 2014. You have to remember, he's counting on his party losing seats, but he's counting on his party to still be strong enough to form a centrist government, because he's not up for election. You have to remember, this is for the prime minister. It's not for the president of France. This is for the seat of prime minister. So what would happen if he has a coalition government which his party is a part of? Well, he would spread out the political blame come the ordinary presidential election, because then his party can't be solely blamed for the situation in France. I think he's hoping to divide and conquer. He's hoping that he can collect other parties to spread this responsibility. And so it's a wise move on his part.
There's another aspect to that. Technically, if they dissolve parliament and they hold the snap election, this will mechanically push the next election, if I'm not mistaken, to 2029. Everybody's writing his obituary this week, early this week, but that's not the case at all. I think you made a very good point. He's a very canny politician that was put into place, groomed, in fact, no pun intended for the other story, groomed, in fact, by Jacques Attali. Okay, so Anna Rothschild's bank, the main investment banking cartel, he's their man, basically. So he has a lot of people behind him and a lot of interests behind him that would like him to be steering the ship. So what you're saying, Matt, is they don't care what's happening below deck so much; it's who's on top deck.
Exactly. That's and as for the election, it's I think Macron's election, or the presidential election in France, is still set for 2027, no matter what. But otherwise, you're quite correct. The other election will be pushed forward. But I don't. Macron will still. The presidential election will still be in 2027, if I'm not mistaken. As long as this cohabitation with other parties can spread the guilt around, I think that Macron has actually made a very wise move. And the ones in opposition, and even if it should happen that Le Pen's party should come into government, so there will be a prime minister from Le Pen and President Macron, he could still be able to use that, because he will be adamant in putting any blame on the government in the presidential elections of 2027. Because if Le Pen is running the government, then he can say, well, look at what's happening in France. The pensions aren't being paid, and there are still massive amounts of immigrants flooding France. Don't trust Le Pen. You have seen her in power now since 2024. It's not safe to vote for her. So even if he loses, or his party loses, it could still be a win for Macron. So once again, he's a very savvy politician, and I think he's all the people saying that, oh, this is dangerous, or this is the last Macron's last desperate stand. It's his Waterloo. Pardon my French. It's bullshit. This is a calculated political move by Macron, and I would say it's a very wise one.
Interesting that I'm not drawing any comparisons at all, by the way, but interesting that you have identified this kind of preemptive move in a way. Very short window, of course, extremely short window for this French election. We're talking about like less than 5 weeks. Now, the UK, something similar happened with the snap election. It was called, and a lot of people, why on earth he's at low ebb right now in terms of polling, Rishi Sunak. The Tories are getting hammered. Everyone's pretty much said, it's a done deal. Keir Starmer and the Labour Party are going to trounce and look at the polling. But the Tories are, one of the greatest Machiavellian political organizations in European history, and have a knack for survival that is unparalleled, and have put together some crazy coalitions in the past. In fact, the one that brought them into power with David Cameron and the Liberal Democrats, giving Nick Clegg the deputy prime minister position in 2010. I mean, who saw that coming? And then the other blinder they pulled with the DUP to basically keep Jeremy Corbyn chained down. I mean, the Tories are absolutely brilliant Machiavellians, and they've been behind and ended up winning. They've done coalitions with their polar opposite, so anything's possible. So by preemptively making the move, I agree, Mats. It's definitely worth keeping a very close eye on these situations. All might not be what it seems. So that's definitely worth looking at. Now, we've got a couple of minutes left on the European front, Mats. There was a big push for an EU army. That's what it was called colloquially, but it's a combined European defense force. They passed the PESCO doctrine, if you will. This is the procurement for Europe. This was all heading quite nicely through 2017, 2018, 2019. And then when the Ukraine crisis began, and when obviously when the actual war kicked off in February 2022, all of that European defense stuff came to a grinding halt. NATO was a brain dead organization before that, and all of a sudden it's all about NATO. But what you said, Matt, leads me to believe that maybe they could be adopting a two-tier approach. One is for the procurement and the organization of the economy around the arms industry. And then in terms of the tactical, the command, that's done on the upper layer, which is NATO, led by the United States. I just can't for the life of me, looking at the expansion of U.S. bases in Europe right now, I cannot for the life of me, Mats, and in Sweden especially, and Finland, I can't for the life of me see the United States relinquishing power over Europe that is gained in the last 3 years, which is unprecedented in the post-war era. It was all trending in the other direction. All of a sudden, that's reversed now. We've got a couple minutes left. I want to get your final thoughts. EU army, or is it just going to be an operational layer with NATO on top?
It's just going to be an operational layer with NATO on top, no matter what the European politicians say. And I think once again, concerning this procurement thing, we have to look at the dominance of the investment bankers and how they control the flows of credit and investment funds and bank loans. And these loans are once again financing an expansion of military material that's going to be used in a war, a huge or a larger war that will write off these debts later and will put the countries once again into a situation where they will become dependent on these banksters and the supply of money as they've been before. However, of course, there is a counter movement to this system, but the question is, will it be strong enough, quickly enough, to take us away from the brink of what happened in 1914? But the European so-called defense fund or defense initiative is basically just an economic procurement idea to see that NATO can be funded without actually saying it's NATO that's doing the military investments. So it's a double system, but they all work for the same master. That's my take on that situation. Right or wrong, I don't know. I'm kind of speculating here, but based on what I've seen throughout history for the last 50 to 60 years, I would say that's your assessment is quite right.
The amount of investment the U.S. is putting in Poland, Finland, Sweden, the northern Arctic tip of Norway, as well as other sites in Britain. I think they're trying to roll Ireland into NATO very aggressively right now, where Ireland's always had a policy of neutrality. That's nearly going out the window. Who knows whether that can be reversed or not. With the Gaza situation in Ireland, that could change the political tide a little bit towards the neutrality position, maybe back in line with that. But the big thing, the big obstacle for Europe has always been foreign policy. How do you get a unified foreign policy across Europe? This has been Brussels' biggest challenge. That's the final, block in the Jenga tower known as the European Union. And if they could only get everybody to be on one page and one mind, foreign policy-wise, they've nearly done it with this Ukraine phenomenon in terms of the political buy-in and the flag waving and all this, the war effort. But and I think if anything, that will be the biggest victory for the Atlanticist bloc, is if they can get a unified foreign policy, at least by proxy. And that makes Washington's job very easy. And it makes NATO's job very easy, because NATO no longer has to negotiate with these governments. It's literally turnkey. It's a turnkey operation. It certainly feels like that right now, Mats. It really feels like they're close to it, but the best laid plans of mice and men, the best laid plans, as Robert Burns famously said, it might not work.
And I think they're going a bridge too far right now, because as you've seen, they're trying to pull this unity towards China as well. And the European politicians are going to the Southeast Asian area and saying we have to stop China. That's going a bridge too far, and that might be their undoing.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely correct on that. China definitely a bridge too far for Europe, but this is where they're being led. This is where they're being led by the big leash. We'll see how this plays out, but I do have some positive feelings and some positive impulses coming from these election results as maybe an indicator, but an early indicator. But we'll see. As you say, Mats, don't expect any major policy shifts as a result of what we've seen over the weekend. I agree with you on that. Mats Nilsson, political commentator, historian, thank you very much for joining us on TNT this week. Very important analysis from Mats Nilsson. Top of the hour news headline coming up. And when we get back on the other side, pivoting over to the United States, Dustin Stockton, America Mission, the laptop challenge at the Hunter Biden trial. We're going to get a full dose of all of this on the other side. Stay with us, folks. We'll be right back.
Today's News Talk, TNT Radio.